I'm just getting ready to go on the walk today to look for some painting inspiration, and it is pretty cloudy out there and it rained overnight, so it's probably going to be pretty muddy, but we're going on a 5-mile walk today, and part of that walk will be around a nature reserve, and there will also be a walk through some woodland and some fields, so there's hopefully going to be lots of things to see and lots of things to paint, regardless of the weather. Should be nice anyway, so let's go! These videos are primarily about going out and finding painting inspiration, but they've also become more of kind of a nature diary as well, where I'm looking for signs of different seasons, and that was definitely the case for this video as well. As much as I was looking for a nice thing to paint, I was also looking for early signs of spring, which has become one of my favourite things to do at the moment. And you'll probably already know that if you've watched previous videos. I am impatient for spring to come around, so I did spend quite a bit of time on this walk looking for those early signs of the season. I do think now is a good time of year to try and learn some things about wildlife because things are a little bit quieter. I know in the spring it can be difficult to learn what all the flowers are and what all the trees are and all the species because there's so much happening all at once. But if you start now when things are a bit quieter, you can take the time to learn things just one at a time as they emerge rather than having to try and figure out what everything is all at once. Gorse is a nice early flower, which we've already seen in a few previous episodes of Artist Diaries, but I saw that again on this walk, and it was a nice reminder that things are starting to turn and flowers are starting to come out. I also saw my first snowdrops of the year on this walk, so that was really exciting. That always feels like a nice milestone to reach. I also found these lovely catkins, which I believe are hazel, but I'm happy to be corrected on this because this is one of the things that I'm still learning. Hazel trees do have catkins at this time of year, and I believe they also have a slight red coloration to some of the buds and tiny hairs on the end of the branches, and I could see that in this particular tree. So that's what my thinking is, but I am happy to be corrected. So if you have any suggestions as to what this is, then feel free to put a comment below. Another exciting find on this trip was this lovely little flower, which I believe is blackthorn blossom, and if it is, it will be the first I've seen this season. There were only a couple of flowers, but in a few weeks to a month's time, this is going to be absolutely covered in white blossom, and it will be so beautiful. The blossom of blackthorn is quite similar to the blossom of hawthorn, but a nice way to try and tell them apart at this time of year when it comes to the flowers is that blackthorn will come into blossom before it has any leaves, and hawthorn comes into blossom at the same time as it has leaves. So if you see it and it's completely covered in white flowers and there are no leaves, then it's probably going to be blackthorn. As well as the flowers, it was also nice to see a little more bird activity. Things are starting to sing a little bit more now and they're more active, as if they're kind of getting ready to gear up for the spring. I saw goosander out on the lake, although they just look like tiny specks in the distance with my phone camera. The males have green heads and the females have red. You can't really tell that from this terrible footage. I also heard loads of great tits calling on this walk. They sound a little bit like a bicycle pump, and if you listen in the next video clip, then hopefully you'll be able to hear that. And at the end, you might also be able to hear a buzzard calling as well. So now we've spent some time discussing the nature I saw on this trip, it is probably time to get down to talking about painting, because ultimately that is what this video is all about. And I actually found it quite difficult to choose a painting subject for today, despite the fact that the place was so beautiful and there were lots of things that were inspiring. It was hard to find a photo that looked like it would make a really great painting. I loved the glassy look of this lake, but I felt like it lacked a focal point. I really liked the sunlight over the bridge in another image, but I wasn't overly keen on the composition and I felt like something was missing from it. I really liked the sky colour here, but I wasn't entirely sure about the tree being right in the middle, and I felt like it was still lacking something. In the end, I think I went for quite an unusual choice in comparison to what else I saw on the day. I ignored the lovely lake scenes and I was actually drawn to this scene of the countryside. And it's hard to explain why. It just appeals to me, and there was just something about this landscape that spoke to me when I was there and made me really want to paint it. I really love rolling hills of countryside. It's one of my favourite types of countryside, if you can have a favourite type. Although there was something about this scene that really appealed to me, I still felt like I would have to work at the composition to make it come together and make a nice painting. I knew I wanted to include the ash tree. It's one of my favourite types of tree and it just stood out to me as soon as I saw it, but I thought it might need a little bit of assistance. I might need to add to the composition to make it work all together as a painting. This viewpoint formed the basis of the composition, and then I thought I would just add to it. And one of the first things I decided to add was a couple of sheep because I'd seen them in the field and I knew I had some old photos of sheep that I'd taken previously that I could superimpose. So that formed the basic idea and it gave me a place to start, and I thought I could alter things as I carried on with the painting. As usual, I'm painting onto oil painting paper, which I've cut down to 6 by 8 inches, and I'm starting with a loose sketch of burnt sienna just to get a rough outline of things, and then I do a very loose block in where I try and get the colours down so that I can put some more detail over the top. You'll notice that I also decided to add a path to this as well. I felt like there was something missing from the bottom right corner of the painting, and I thought a nice muddy path leading into the field would be a good addition, especially because we'd walked through quite a lot of mud on the day anyway, so it felt like it was true to the scene. I've always struggled when it comes to creating my own composition, and in fact for a long time I just didn't really create my own compositions. I would paint photos pretty much exactly as I saw them rather than trying to change anything, and it wasn't because I didn't want to, because I would have really liked to create my own composition. It was more the fact that I didn't really know how to. And I have read into the theory of composition. Occasionally I've read lots of tips on creating nice compositions, but sometimes knowing the theory of it and then applying it to your own work are two completely different things. So although I'd understand some elements of it, it didn't necessarily make it any easier when I was trying to do it myself. I've come across tips about trying not to make a painting too symmetrical, about trying to balance things out a little bit so it's not too heavy on one side. I've also read the tip that it is better to work in thirds and maybe have 2/3 land, 1/3 sky, or the other way around, rather than just doing 50-50. And on looking at this painting, I realized that my sky and land is kind of 50-50. So it shouldn't work, but I don't think it's too much of a disaster. I think the hills and the tree extending into the sky actually makes up for that in this case, but I just wanted to point out that that is another tip I've come across as well. But as I mentioned before, just because I knew these tips didn't mean that it was easy to apply them to my own work, so although I've had this rattling around in my head, I've not really made much use of these tips. I couldn't understand how other artists managed to do it, how they could go and see a scene and know what needed to be moved around to make it more successful as a painting, and then also to have the skill to carry that out successfully, because just because you know what needs to be moved doesn't necessarily mean it will be very easy to paint it that way, because you're deviating from what you can actually see in your reference. It's something that I feel like I'm only just beginning to try out, and it's taken a while to get here. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that it's taken me a while to get to the stage where I want to try out my own composition ideas. I think when you're just starting out as an artist, there is so much to learn that it can be a little bit overwhelming trying to do everything all at once. There's the technical aspect of painting to figure out what materials you need, what mediums you might want to use, and what the difference is. There's information on colour theory, on getting your tones and your values right. It's really easy to get overloaded with all of this information, and composition is just another thing on top of that. So I think copying my reference photos pretty much exactly as I saw them was a really good first step into understanding landscapes. And I don't think it's a bad thing that I didn't rush into trying to do my own composition straight away. I probably would have gotten very confused. And in doing it this way, it's allowed me to practice repeatedly. And I think that repeated practice has given me some good ideas for composition in the future. When I finish a painting and I look at the end result, I can try and evaluate it and see whether there's something in it that really bothers me. Is there something about the way I've laid it out that just doesn't sit right? And doing that regularly and looking back at those paintings, it gives me a good idea of what works and what doesn't. So I think over time, I've gradually built up a better idea of what to do in my paintings in regards to composition. This doesn't mean that I am an expert on composition by any stretch. There's still lots that I would like to learn before I can make some really great paintings, but I do think this is a nice first step. There were some decisions that I took with this painting to try and improve the feel of it, which I don't think I would have been able to do several years ago when I first started. So to recap on some of the things that I did to try and improve the composition of this piece, I added in the sheep on the left hand side so there would be a little bit more interest and your eye moves around the painting a little more. I also added in the path in the foreground just for an extra level of interest. It was looking quite bare in that section, and it also leads your eye quite nicely into the rest of the painting. I took the decision to remove some trees and hedges that I thought would be a little bit distracting, and they didn't really add very much to the painting. I also took out the pylon that was in the backfield because that didn't really have any place in this painting. It wasn't adding anything to it, so it was an unnecessary distraction. And by simplifying things in the background, I think that helps to draw your attention to what's going on in the foreground of the painting. Despite my efforts, I do still think that there are elements of this composition that could be improved on. I think the sheep kind of line up too precisely with the tree, so I'd probably change the position of one of them just to vary that up a bit if I painted this again. I might also play around with the position of the sky in relation to the ground to look at doing the painting in thirds rather than a 50-50 split. Although, as I mentioned before, I don't think that worked out too badly for this. I think because of how the hills are quite rolling, and again, as I mentioned, as the tree extends into that sky, I don't think it's as noticeable that it's a 50-50 split, so I'm not too sure whether I would change that if I did this again. Overall, I quite like this painting and I'm pleased with how it turned out, not just in terms of composition, but there are also other elements that I felt worked well in this piece, which I know I've struggled with in paintings previously. I was happy with how the sky turned out. Sometimes I tend to make my clouds a little bit too dark and then the day looks like it's really overcast, so I'm pleased that this looks quite nice and bright. I was also pleased with how the tree turned out because I really struggled to do loose trees like this where they kind of blend into the background. I usually make them look too messy and too detailed, so I was really pleased with how that turned out. I don't think the addition of the sheep or the path turned out too distracting, so I think they fit in quite nicely, and I enjoyed adding in the reflections of the sky into the puddles in the muddy path as well. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and that you've liked seeing this painting come together. Please let me know if you have any comments below, either about the painting or maybe about wildlife. Have you seen any very early signs of spring yet? And yes, I know we're still in January, but have you seen any snowdrops or blossom? Or is it still very much winter where you are? Or perhaps you have some thoughts on painting composition. Maybe that's something that you've been working on as well. If you have any comments on that, please feel free to leave them under this video. It's always lovely to have your feedback, and I really appreciate you taking the time to watch these videos. I really enjoy making them, and I'm very much looking forward to the next one, although I'm not entirely sure where I will be going to find painting inspiration next time, but I will get thinking about it. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.